Let me check on that. We have.
There's the man himself,
Missing.
Dr. Sugrue.
Yeah,
Good to see you, sir.
it's nice to see you as well. I'm amazed that people still read books. I recognize you from last time. I'm amazed to get repeats. All right. And James, let me know when you'll be going on your trip so I can get somebody to fill in for you.
Oh, well, the trip is on hold for now, but I'm getting married on the 19th, so I'll miss that.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Good
Yep.
for you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be missing that class.
All right. Is everybody here, Jenny?
A majority of people, or they'll be coming in as you start.
Okay. Well, all right. What do you think of the politics?
Hair splitting.
Hair splitting. Okay. Well, look. Nobody has ever accused Aristotle of being excessively poetic. All right. I mean, there are many advantages to him, and he has many virtues. But nobody ever said I was transported by Aristotelian poetry. As I said last time, it's sort of like the parts list to the universe. And everything has its own little tag, and it explains to you how to construct the universe once you've broken it down into its component parts. And you have to admire that kind of encyclopedic mind. He's very left-brained, very linear in his thinking. And, when the medievals called him the master of them that know, there's a lot of truth in that. What else?
I agree with his practical criticisms of Plato's Republic.
Well, okay.
Having property and women and children all in common is probably contrary to human nature.
Plato casts a very large shadow over the politics. Aristotle is criticizing both the Republic and the laws. And of course, since they're very different books, he has very different criticisms. But for him, the family is foundational. In other words, we're not going to get to political theory organized around the idea of the individual until we get to the Enlightenment. The individual as a category of political thought doesn't exist here. Neither does a connected idea, the idea of private life, right? The idea of a right to privacy would make the Greeks look at you funny, like, why would you want that? The idea is that human beings naturally occur not as individuals, not as atoms, but as molecules, minimally a breeding pair, a male and a female. Please don't get embroiled in what those are. All right, I don't want to take the discussion there, but a male and a female that are reproducing. And the reproductive family is the minimal unit of Aristotelian politics. And that'll be the minimal unit of political thought for the Romans and for the medievals. It's not until we get to I guess, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, the great social contractarians, that the molecule will be broken down into atomized individuals. And if you want to see that in literature, that's what Robinson Crusoe is about. What else?
I'm curious.
Well,
Go
how
ahead.
do we get from the city-state to the nation-state using Aristotle's way of seeing the world? What would he think of that?
Aristotle is writing in a strangely anachronistic way. He's the tutor to Alexander the Great, and Alexander the Great is going to destroy all the Greek polises, and we are now going to enter a new phase in human history. Well, actually not a new phase, because it's happened before, but it'll be a polycultural empire. And even though it doesn't last very long, the age of empires is here. Now, Aristotle, looking backwards, says, well, look, what I know and what strikes me as being civilized is the Greek tradition of the polis, because it's the right size. Remember that the golden mean is so important for Aristotle. It's not so small that you can't have a satisfactory division of labor and division of status. On the other hand, it's not so big so that people don't know or trust each other. So Aristotle is writing unintentionally a eulogy for the polis, right? And of course, it's when Alexander the Great takes over Greece and then goes east that Aristotle himself gets in trouble and is forced to leave Athens. So the connection between the city-state and the nation-state, I think, is very attenuated. I think that the idea of a nation-state holding together one cultural or linguistic group, that's always been an idealization to greater or lesser degrees. Right? I mean, there are always outliers and stragglers. It's just a question of how many. And then, of course, the big multicultural, multilinguistic empires. Here I'm thinking particularly of Persia. All right. They suggest that Aristotle has not fully investigated the problem, or investigated the problem in a way that was prospective rather than retrospective. What else?
I'm curious what you think Aristotle would have to say about the contemporary workforce. He compares wage labor, or he talks about wage labor in Book 1, Chapter 11. He says it's performed by only those who lack any art but are useful only for their bodies. Mm-hmm. And again, this is kind of linked with his talk about slavery somewhat to an extent. But he talks about animate possessions in Chapter 4, and how if we did have possessions like Daedalus, he makes the reference to, which could kind of perform the work for us, as we now have machines which do, maybe we would be able to alleviate some of these kind of necessary jobs which slaves undertake to kind of leave room for the aristocratic class, basically.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. First thing to note, Aristotle, like Plato, like all the other Greeks and all the other Romans, is explicitly inegalitarian. You're not going to get an admixture of egalitarianism until we get to the Christians, right? Because all people are equal in the sight of God, the differences between human beings empirically shrinks to insignificance for Christians. On the other hand, for Aristotle, because he's a very naturalistic and rather empirical thinker, he looks around at the world and says, I don't know of any civilization that doesn't have slaves, and they're never part of the body politic. They have the status of animate shovels, right? So this inegalitarianism is deeply dehumanizing, and it also justifies some really awful treatment. Now, here's the problem, all right? Plato might be able to take a poetic flight of imagination and rethink the way in which societies are divided up. But for Aristotle, because he's a naturalistic and rather empirical thinker, he looks around and says, look, if you don't have any slaves, you can't have any Parthenon, and you can't have any great political movements, and you can't have any great art or literature. So he says civilization requires slavery, so it must be that slavery is natural. And from that, he's going to try and find a way to naturalize the slavery of people who aren't Greek. All right. Now, this should run into all kinds of problems. I always wondered what would have Aristotle replied if somebody had asked, in what sense the Egyptians who constructed the pyramids were lacking in Greek rationality. In other words, if they don't have sufficient rationality to govern themselves, and that's his excuse for slavery, what they're doing is a pretty good substitute for it, because it looks to me like somebody must have been imposing rational order on that society in order to get these gigantic things built. So often I would like to point to possible counterexamples to Aristotle. And that's the kind of thing that would actually make him stop and think. I'm not sure that it would make him give up the idea of slavery, because he's too committed to the idea of inegalitarian human nature. But I think he would have to modify his description so that he could include things like the great river valley civilizations, which were neither Greek nor uncivilized. What else?
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, come on, don't be shy. You didn't come here to look at me.
I just feel like a lot of times he makes an argument that appeals to nature, and I was discussing this previously, and I just feel like I wish I would be able to ask him, what makes you think that you have been able to comprehend the final telos of anything you're talking about?
Well done, yes. Aristotle is committed to the idea of natural teleology. In other words, all the things in nature have a natural telos, or purpose. So in other words, a hand serves the purpose of grasping. That's its natural purpose. If your hand seizes up somehow and can't grasp things anymore, then it's a bad hand. But if it does a good job of grasping things, then it's a good hand. So there's a natural telos in your hand, and there's a natural telos for the eye. That's to see things. If your eye is blind, it's not a good eye. Now, what Aristotle would think is that it's very important not to try and grasp things with your eye. And also, if you try and see things with your eyes closed, but your hand moving all about, you're going to find that you don't see anything. So you have to not only know the proper purpose of things, but you must also employ the proper thing that is whose nature is that particular purpose. Now, this is not just true of natural things, it's also true of artificial things. So art, for example, is intended to do a great many things. One is to offer us an experience of beauty. It may have many other things too. A sword, the purpose of that is to cut things. A spear, the purpose of that is to impale things. So he asks, since constitutions, which are the essence or the core of a government, must have a function, since everything has a function, what's its function? And he says it's the best kind of human life, because people are naturally political. It's a way of saying that human beings are social animals. The Greek term he uses is zoon politikon. All right. So we're naturally social, which means we naturally are found in families, but the family is aggregate together. We get a village or a community, and from there we build up to a polis, and that's as far as it goes, because if it gets bigger than that, it can no longer achieve the purposes of solidarity, because you can't really know personally, let's say 330 million people as we have in the US.
Yeah, that's true.
What else?
Professor, that was actually following up on the large size of our country. That was sort of my question, too. I noticed a couple of times Aristotle makes statements like, it's hardly supposed that a great number of persons would all get into a passion and go wrong at the same moment. And things like that, where he seems to say, the large group can do okay, but I'm like, is this just a failure of imagination because times were different and cities were small back then? I mean, large groups go wrong all the time these days.
It has to do with the technological means of communication. The size of communication is limited by the strength of the orator's voice. It's much harder to get an idea or a policy proposal out to millions of people without some kind of technological amplification. Remember, if an orator makes a proposal and then the listeners go back to their families or their friends and tells them about it, what you're going to end up doing is playing the largest game of telephone imaginable. If you remember what that was like in grammar school, when somebody would say something to somebody else, and by the time you get it fifth, sixth, seventh hand, it's completely different. Now imagine that being done multiple times. So technology, particularly the technology of communication, is crucially important to political theory, because it places an upper and often lower limit on the number of people that could be part of the same community. So I think that it's a question of technology, particularly communications. Remember that it would be nice if we could send everybody a textbook, but almost nobody can read. And besides, books, we don't have the printing press yet, so books are really expensive. So there's no easy way out to that. And so he may be right that there's a tendency toward natural limitation in the size of the polis. What he doesn't take account of is the fact that someone like Darius or Xerxes, or even Alexander the Great, his student, might decide that we're going to experiment with new political forms, and these experiments will be predicated on the possibility of mixing together different peoples in such a way that they created a sort of artificial coherence. Remember that when Alexander the Great went from city to city conquering, he had many of his top officers marry into the aristocracy of that city. He would take their daughters in marriage, he'd set them up as his regents, ruling on his behalf. And as they produced children, the idea was that you get a fusion or a hybridization of his Greek and then later on, not just Greek, soldiers and the local population. It's a smart move and an interesting gambit, but unfortunately, his empire didn't last any longer than Alexander did. So it turned out to be a failed experiment, and this is what Aristotle is worrying about. Experimentation is is not necessarily prohibited, but the odds are against it. Remember that in the ancient world, calling somebody an innovator is an insult, right? No, you accuse someone of innovation, that what you're saying is, you mean the ancestors and the gods were wrong? You're a wicked man. I believe there was one Greek polis that forced any person who wanted to address the public and propose a modification of the laws, he had to do so with a noose around his neck. God forbid you should get voted down. How many of you want to agitate for political change with a noose around your neck? Almost nobody does. And actually, it's not completely irrational. Most innovations, like most genetic mutations, are non-adaptive. They get you killed.
I get nervous talking online. I can't imagine talking in front of a bunch of people with a noose around my neck.
There you go, right. Again, they're telling us something about their attitude towards innovation.
And I was listening to Greek history lectures by Professor Kagan, and he said that someone that just people didn't like, or even for no reason, it'd be like, I'm tired of hearing about that guy. You could vote him to get killed.
You could vote him to get killed. More usual, at least in Athens, was to ostracize him. And that doesn't mean shunning him. That means literally they make him go to the east, all right, for 10 years. So in other words, they're exiling him. And you don't have to break the law to get yourself exiled. People can just decide they've had enough of you. In fact, when at the trial of Socrates, what his accusers expected and hoped he would do when he was condemned to death, because he had the right to propose a lesser punishment, what they wanted to do was to have him propose ostracism, and then they'd be able to get rid of him because he's already 70 years old and never come back. Socrates knows that and says, I'm staying right here. It has to do with the journey motif that runs through the dialogues. Ironically, he continues the journey by not going anywhere.
And he also proposed he should get a free lunch every day, right?
That's right, exactly. I wanted to tell that to Milton Friedman. There is such a thing as a free lunch, or at least there used to be. Right? It's the highest honor in the country. And he said, well, it doesn't really equal what I deserve, but I'll settle for that. Free lunch in Prytaneum. You gotta like it. And of course they said, kill this guy. We can't put up with this. What else?
I was really interested in the separation between the public goods and the common goods, and how he seems to come very close to talking about capitalism, but doesn't quite get as far as Adam Smith did, because he talks about the use of barter, pecuniary, that sort of thing. That was, to me, that was most interesting.
Unlike Plato, Aristotle likes the idea of trade because he's not afraid of new things coming in. Remember, in Plato's Laws, he has the city, his second ideal city, far away from the coast, surrounded by mountains, so nobody messes with it. Aristotle says, no, put it at the coast because you can trade and you can make money, and that will make you wealthy, and wealth is a part of the good life. So what Aristotle says is that Plato's wrong in not having the family, but he's also wrong in abolishing private property. And the reason why he's wrong is because people don't take care of public property. And if you look at, or if you're familiar with the idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? Or if you've seen what's happened to our public life, which belongs to everybody, it's easy to tolerate the degradation of that because it's really not your job and it's really not your problem. What does Aristotle say? I think something like, what belongs to everyone belongs to no one. I think there's a lot of truth to that. However, Aristotle is not as enamored of private property as Adam Smith is, or at least not as Adam Smith is in The Wealth of Nations. If you want to get a better balanced view of Adam Smith, you really have to read The Theory of Moral Sentiments. That's crucial because he said you can't be a greedy, nasty individual because that's bad for you and bad for the people around you. So there have to be limits on the accumulation of wealth, because the accumulation of wealth entails the idea of an increase in poverty, and that disjunction between the rich and the poor is extremely dangerous. Another book that's very important if you want to understand what Aristotle's doing in the politics is, and it's underappreciated, is Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. If you go back and you look at the revolution in Corcyra, they have a civil war, and conflict breaks out between the rich and the poor, and they are unable to reach any reasonable common ground, and as a result they attack one another without mercy, and the result is that they destroy their own city. And so both the rich and the poor lose from an excessive and destabilizing inequality of wealth. That's one of the things that I've noticed in the last, certainly in this century in America. The growing levels of inequality are beginning to make the social structure of America look more and more like the social structure of Brazil. Okay, this is really short-sighted. This is a way for rich people to make sure that their children are not rich, all right? In other words, if you want to put your hand in the cookie jar, don't take them all. Leave a few, and that way you can get your hand out of the jar successfully. To be greedy and say, and I'm taking them all, as I would be inclined to say the top 10% of Americans have done in the last 30 years. We scarfed up all the income from the internet economy. I mean, it boomed as a result of the growth of computerization. 10% of the people got 90% of the outcome of that. That's short-sighted and dangerous. There's more to life than topping off your 401k. There is such a thing as the common good. We've lost sight of that. And instead of the old American slogan, e pluribus unum, from many one, our motto now is, where's mine? Okay, keep that up for another generation and make yourself obsolete.
On that note, could you say a little bit about contemporary Aristotelian Alistair MacIntyre?
Yeah.
Yep.
MacIntyre is a brilliant writer. Yep. My problem is that I'm not convinced. While I think virtue ethics has much to say for it, virtue politics is incompatible, I think, with seriously democratic political regimes. All right. The mass of people are notoriously, how can I put it, uncertain in their selection of virtuous rulers.
Yep.
And what counts as virtue in a democratic regime is much more amorphous than it would be in a straightaway regime that is unabashedly and unapologetically elitist.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think that the idea of raising children, for example, I think that the ultimate political issue is education. It's more important than anything else. And one of the great tragedies of American education is that there's no virtue left except affirmation and approval. Everything and everybody has to be approved of. There's no other virtue that we're confident in teaching people. And that's a real difficulty. If you want a kind of moral education in public schools that satisfies everybody, you're going to end up with vague, formless stuff like, it's nice to be nice to the nice, which is true, but it doesn't tell you anything. And it doesn't help you with any of the real hard questions in life. And life is going to give you hard questions whether you like it or not. So virtue ethics requires making distinctions, not just between actions that are virtuous and vicious, but also between people that are virtuous and vicious. It's going to be very hard to, and I think that McIntyre knows this. I just don't think he's all that worried about eroding democracy or democratic elements in our public life because of the fact that he thinks that we have a licentious public, and he's probably right.
Well, and McIntyre says that the polis is the ideal political unit for human flourishing as well. But once you get beyond that, then he thinks that self-governance is an essential part of human flourishing, but you can't really get that from governing in a large, multi-million-person democracy.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Remember,
Israel would be the only country in the world that would meet his definition.
I can think of some others that might make it. North Korea comes close, right? I mean, everybody's been told what to think, and they're all thinking the same thing because there's no alternative. So you lose freedom. I think there are only about 250,000 people in Iceland, 3/4 of whom are related. So they actually have apps there, so you don't date someone that's your first cousin. Because, no, I'm not joking. It's a very small, very enclosed population. I can see how direct democracy might work under such circumstances. And the Swiss have done a pretty good job with democracy, and yet there you have 3 different languages and a number of various cultural groups that have found common ground, along with a bunch of rich people that are hiding from the law. Yeah, right. So my guess is that Montesquieu was right. One-size-fits-all politics is a mistake. You got to ask what kind of people these are, what kind of regime this is. Do they trust one another? Do they like one another? All of those things are going to be important. If you remember, look back at the Federalist Papers. The assumption that the Federalists are making is that this will be a largely culturally homogenous group of citizens, and that
there'll be a kind of virtuous aristocracy to draw from, right?
That's right. That's why we need a Senate. We put them in their own separate house so they don't cause any extra problems.
Yep.
Right? Because there is a natural aristocracy. This comes directly from Jefferson, and the natural aristocrats are going to rise by virtue of their ability, like Alexander Hamilton, for example, regardless of where they get born. So there's in many ways, the founders are looking towards Aristotle. To some of them, perhaps with the idea of natural slavery, although I don't think it's an especially popular idea. Instead, what I see is the founders looking for a mixed polity, a balance of the democratic element in the House of Representatives, the aristocratic element in the Senate, and the one will be our elected sovereign, the president. So we'll have the one, the few, and the many. That is clearly shown in the formulation of the Constitution, right? But the difficulty is, how big can you make this? In other words, it was thought a big, reckless experiment. This is to a great extent what Federalist 10 is about. The idea of having a republic that's bigger than, say, Monaco, right, or San Marino. The idea of 13 colonies coming together in one republic was thought unworkable and impossible. Now, of course, they had a new set of technologies for communication, which were newspapers, but also the committees of correspondence that emerged during the revolution itself, where leaders from Charleston would write to leaders in Boston, who would write to leaders in New York, who would write to leaders in Philadelphia, who would write back to Charleston, so they could all organize. And because there was a very rapid coastal trade, it only took a couple of days, and that was much faster than usual, certainly faster than crossing the Atlantic. So the American Constitution owes a good bit to Aristotle and also to Montesquieu, but it is a new animal, a new attempt. And I think that it was, up to a point, successful. The problem is that the fly in the ointment is slavery. And they never figured out a way to solve the problem, so they kicked it down the road, which may have been prudent in 1789, but the bill came due in 1861. Somebody's got a hand up. V.J. Sutak. Hi.
Hey. There was a line early in the Politics where Aristotle says that the city-state is prior to the individual, which is obviously somewhat counterintuitive, but I took it to mean that the city-state is the ideal potential of the individual. But the fact that he's using time, it just kind of opened up some question marks for me. Like, why is he making a sort of chronological metaphor for cause and effect? And is he at all implying that, maybe human beings are not, like, maybe this is not egalitarianism, but maybe there is some sort of evolution? And, you'd mentioned, like, Alexander tearing through Asia, as an example, prior to Alexander, there were no anthropomorphic depictions of the Buddha in, like, Buddhist cultures. But then it gets sort of Hellenized, and you have these, Greek statue-looking Buddhas. Like, in Aristotle's mind, obviously this is like speculative, but like, would that be sort of on the road to the Greek city-state? Is there some kind of evolution happening here?
That's a really interesting question, very complicated one. I don't know if I've been working on a history book for a long time, but one of the funny things is that if you've ever got a chance to look at those statues in India that they've dug up, you have Buddha wearing a toga looking very much like Apollo. All right. So clearly we brought some craftsmen out there. They got a new guy to deify, and they gave us Buddha that looks like Apollo Belvedere. Now, to get to the meat of your question, we have to have the polis before human life can realize the telos that's built into it. In other words, you can't, in order to be a full citizen, you have to be an adult male head of household. And it's only at that point that you're able to express your individuality, because in smaller groups, the preconditions for having a fully developed individual life, like Alexander the Great himself did, aren't there yet. You'll be the daddy of the house if you only have a family and you're living on a deserted island. But you will not be able to be a citizen of a family, because citizenship comes later. So if you want to achieve the highest good, which is, first of all, a life of rational contemplation, and second of all, a life of honorable action in the service of creating the possibility of a life of rational contemplation, then you need the polis in order to make that possible, right? And this is actually a very important idea. If you look as far in the future as Thomas More's Utopia, there's no idea of the individual. There's no idea of private life. There are no locks on the doors in Utopia because, well, why would anyone want to have privacy? All right. Why would anybody want to have individuality? Everybody wears the same clothes. They have a kind of Mao suit. And that way we get equality and stability, even if it's somewhat lacking in fashion sense. What else? Oh, come on. Don't be bashful.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to backtrack to talking about the different kinds of communications that allowed for the American experiment to sort of kick off.
Yeah.
Particularly in communication. I was curious, this was something that came up in our small group discussion that we didn't fully get to unpack, but what are the implications of the internet and social media? I know that there's probably not one answer to this, but
yeah, it's a box of worms. Okay. The thing that I would say is very much worth looking at for the last of the real pre-internet theories of communication and its political implications is clearly Habermas's theory of communicative action. I know. Right? I used to like it too, and I still do in a way, but there's an awful lot of hubris there, and we must be very careful of that. Now, with regard to the internet, well, there are lots of different ways of looking at it, and I couldn't scratch the surface, much less finish it. But what if, let's just knock this around, what if the internet is the newly formed central nervous system of a giant, global-sized German collective subject? In other words, it covers the whole planet. It connects not everybody, but damn close. I mean, we're moving in that direction. And in other words, what we're creating there is a planet-sized multicellular animal, and you're the cells. That's not impossible. 50 years from now, what happens when we can start implanting chips in our brain? I mean, granted, it'll be easier to take math class, but I don't know if that will allow us to hold on to the communities that we have or the sense of self that we have. That's actually what I think of it this way, all right? In my view, much of human history has amounted to the externalization of somatic processes. In other words, we're outsourcing. Cooking food, the invention of fire, that's pre-digestion, makes it a lot easier to do. Writing stuff down, the invention of writing, that saves a lot of memory, so you can do other stuff with it. That's why we can't memorize the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the ancients could. They had a lot more invested in memory. In other words, what you do with your brain, and you can look this up, there's good medical reason to believe it true. What you do with your brain habitually, and particularly early on, changes the neural architecture of the brain itself. That's why practicing the piano makes you play better. Okay, don't listen to this, Genevieve. What about this upcoming generation that spend all their time peering into tiny little boxes? Do you think that modifies their neural architecture? Well, you old guys, and I see a couple here, do you know how to operate your cell phone, or do you ask your children? Yeah, you're all going, yeah, I don't know how it works either. Their neural architecture has actually been modified. Their brains are different from ours. And that would go a long way in explaining things. Now, what happens? Now, you got to remember how unequal the planet is. Half the people on this planet have never made a phone call, right? We have been remiss in dealing with global poverty. And so the difficulty that I have is, suppose we were to manage to give everybody internet access through some advantageous technological use of solar energy and cheap chips and something like that. All right, then we have everybody plugged in to one big planet-sized central nervous system. What do we do to organize that? Now, we are living through the result of not organizing that, and that's clearly not sustainable. All right. On the other hand, do you really want a government-sponsored Ministry of Truth that decides what's real and what isn't? I mean, if this government was being led by Plato, I might be willing to give it a try, but Platonists and real ones are in short supply. So what is it about any of the people running governments now that makes you feel confident that they understand the distinction between reality and illusion any better than you do? Are we going to legislate reality? Good luck with that. Are you going to not legislate reality? Well, now you're going to get Q and the various kinds of crazy conspiracy theories on the net. And as the net grows and extends, that's only going to get worse. So we are living in a new age, and we need to deal with the problems of politics and communication in a new way. Those of you who are young enough to think about these things, if I were, I mean, suppose we got to live to 1,000, so I could take all the degrees and study all the stuff I want to. That's what I would really like, but I can't. Okay. If I were going to law school today, the problem that would interest me most and that I would go in with the intention of solving is how do we organize internet companies, all right, and create something like a new system of antitrust regulation. Breaking it up is dangerous because you want these things to be interactive. The advantage of Microsoft or Apple is that all the things work together. Okay, so there are problems with interconnectivity if you break it up. If you don't break it up, you have unelected people who have happened to have won the economic and technological lottery deciding what's real. Do you feel comfortable with Elon Musk determining reality for you? I do not, much less any of the others. Okay, but if they're not going to decide what's reality, who or what is? You want to take a vote on it? I don't like that either. You want to look around at an elite, find a couple of dozen platonic gold people that know that. Well, here's the problem. If such people exist, regular folks like you and me would not be able to recognize them because we're dumb bronze schlubs, right? So if platonic guardians existed, dummies like me and you wouldn't be able to recognize them. So they'd have to, for our benefit, seize power and hold on to it. And of course, that's going to involve a group of silver people threatening to kill us. Okay, so it doesn't look like democracy is going to work. It doesn't look like an aristocracy is going to work. And it doesn't look like the rule of Zuckerberg or whatever it is, the guy that runs, what the hell do they call it? This is just me having a bet. Facebook, right. Any of those, or the guys that run Google, none of those people are any better to decide what reality is than any name drawn at random from the phone book. I know there aren't any phone books anymore, but it's the idea. Okay, so the one, the few, and the many doesn't seem to be able to do this. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seemed like as I was reading through the politics, that was one of the things that sort of struck me is this sort of, and you developing this idea of changes in communication really affecting the abilities of different regimes to form. It seems to me we're running up fast on the need to someone to come up with a new politics, a new Aristotle's politics, because it seems to me this level of communication and interconnectivity, Aristotle doesn't have an answer for any of that in this whole book.
Right.
And I've not seen anyone come up with a great answer either yet. So that's something I find
a good point. I'm not sure if we need a new Aristotle to look around at all the regimes that have previously existed and then to categorize them for us, because I don't think we're going to find what we need there. In some ways, it's like the challenge that that single-celled life faced with the growing amount of oxygen in the atmosphere over 1 billion years or so. They had to find some way of metabolizing oxygen. And when one of those things had an advantageous mutation that allowed oxygen to be treated as an energy source rather than as a caustic and deadly substance, that took over the world. Well, I'm not sure we want Aristotle looking around at things. I wonder if we don't need Plato and his flights of fancy, imagining what could be the case. But here's the problem. In order to keep Plato on the ground, we have to put some kind of ankle weights on the guy, elsewise he's going to float off like a soap bubble, and we're going to end up in an imaginary world. I want it imaginary, but not too imaginary, which is the great thing about Aristotle. We should tie a string on Plato's finger and have Aristotle pull it down to earth every once in a while. The difficulty is, so I don't think there's anything in our history which explains to us how to approach this. And
I love that.
I was thinking.
It could be though.
Well, go ahead.
I said it could be though, because it could be that the internet and the discourse on the internet is sublimated to the nation state, such as like China now has the Chinese internet and Russia has the Russian internet, and pretty soon we might be going to like the quote unquote Western world internet and kind of subduing the discourse that way so that it is not at a scale that's completely unmanageable. It's within the realm of, some sort of framework that we already understand.
That's a good point. The difficulty is that the tailoring of the internet always serves the interests of the people who are already in charge. And these interests are conflicting. So that everyone is going to get conflicting information, and they'll have conflicting beliefs about what's real. And I think that we can see that in a very dangerous way in Russia today, where we're told that the invasion of the Ukraine is really about getting rid of the dangerous Nazis that were about to attack Russia with nuclear weapons or biological weapons or whatever. If you actually go to Russia and do opinion polls, people say, yeah, you got to watch out for those. We can't wait for the Nazis there to destroy us. Well,
even though Zelensky himself is Jewish.
Well, okay, we can overlook.
How, Professor Sugrue, how would that be any different than the communication within those nation states or regional blocks prior to the internet? Right, like, if the internet didn't exist, newspapers in Russia would be saying that, and newspapers in the United States would be saying what we're saying now. It's just, I'm not advocating for this as a future form. I'm just saying it's one conceivable form of what could happen to the internet.
That's an excellent point. In the age of newspapers and later the age of television and radio, it was easier to enclose a regime in terms of access to information. But a big part of what destroyed the Soviet bloc was television that they were able to pick up in Hungary or in Eastern Germany or Poland. And they were looking at Western sitcoms and wondering, how come all these people are so rich? How come they don't have to get papers in order to cross the street? And in that respect, their borders were permeable. And the U.S., of course, took advantage of that with things like the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and all that kind of stuff. And we're doing something like that, and South Korea is doing something like that with the North Korean regime. And it scares the hell out of them. The difficulty with the internet is that it seems to be so centralized that it is relatively easy to control. It's not nearly so permeable. And that's troubling. I don't know any way out of it. I mean,
I wonder if maybe Marshall McLuhan might have something to say on this.
I can easily believe that. The content of what we can access is determined in the soft sense, in other words, limited rather than fixed by the means of communication. And it may be that the strange centralization of characteristic of internet culture makes it much harder to ride shotgun over it and impose controls on it. So this is, of course, the problem for the next generation coming up. In some ways, I'm very glad that their neural architecture is different from that of old guys like me, because old guys like me are stumped.
Well, that presupposes that our current open internet is actually open, right? And the reality is that algorithms determine, what shows up in your Google search based on your previous browsing history and what you see on Facebook and what you see on Twitter, and so we currently have a very filtered view of the internet that we do see.
And even worse, what we used to take for granted, some degree of privacy, I think that is increasingly impossible. Somewhere, somebody, and maybe more than one somebody, knows every keystroke everybody here has ever made. So think of whatever it is you were doing on the internet that you shouldn't have been doing. There's somebody that knows about it. And that's true for billions of people. So they're actually able to build up psychological or political profiles of you. It seems to me like we're moving very dangerously here in the direction of something like a Chinese social credit system. And I don't like the looks of that, but I don't know how to lasso a runaway internet. All right. You should not expect privacy on the internet, no matter what you do and no matter how good you think your encryption is. If you do, you'll end up like Osama bin Laden. Right? Sooner or later, somebody's going to break it and get into you, if they haven't broken it already. So VPN may be a good idea. The idea that that's going to give you absolute or complete privacy, not so much.
I would just add that I think that, one of the effects of the current internet is the sort of stripping of individuality. So yes, there's no privacy, but what is privacy when you don't exist as an individual? I think that maybe it's a cynical take, maybe I'm like an old boomer kind of looking at a younger generation, but you have people who are sort of sublimated into brands, so to speak, and they're just part of this whole content machine that is, really convoluted, and that's about as accurate as I can describe it.
Much of the internet is offering people freedom, right? But they're all offered the chance to be free in the same way. And they take it and say, wow, I'm feeling really liberated now. And me and another million people who think exactly the same stuff or almost the same stuff, because it's hard to get serious, deep analysis on a web page or, God help us, in an internet back and forth chat. And of course, when discourse is reduced to 140 characters, it becomes just screaming at each other. And it's hard to see how that has any positive outcome.
But isn't it like always kind of been that way? Well, I mean, at least as far as I remember, like if you go back to, if you even look at cable news and the 24-hour news cycle and somebody coming on and talking about something and only having a set amount of time, that devolved into screaming matches too. The difference now is that everybody's engaged in it.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think everybody's engaged in it. I think that there's a small fraction of people that are completely engaged in screaming at people they don't like. And they come from every domain in the political perspective, in the political spectrum. In other words, there's crazies everywhere, and there's a few that want to make it personal and find out where you live and post that so that crazy people can send you bomb threats and stuff like that. Or so they can make up crimes for you that you didn't commit. You can have internet rumors, which very quickly become internet memes. And it turns out that memes, unlike sentences, are neither true nor false. They're out in some space where nothing is real except what you happen to believe. Also notice the high estimation of feeling. Everybody tells me nowadays about how they feel. That feels problematic. And you see, again, I don't blame the people that say that. I blame their teachers. You didn't come to my class to have your feelings. Have your feelings at home. As James knows, have your feelings at home. And when you come to my class, tell me what you think and why. Nobody thinks anymore because, well, it's not a question of how you think. You have your perspective, and every perspective is equally good and equally valid. So whatever nonsense you tell people, everyone else has to say, that's really great. I don't have quite the same nonsense, but I want everybody to give me respect that I haven't earned.
Professor, isn't another risk, I feel like I've heard you talk about this before, that at a deeper, more philosophical level, there's this notion there is no dialogue anymore. This postmodern notion that we're just chattering monkeys with will to power. We can't even have discourse anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are times when I'm feeling particularly cynical, and I say to myself, Foucault is better than we deserve. I said the same thing about Donald Trump. Both of these guys I really like desperately, or dislike desperately. And yeah, the idea of rational discourse has given way to power without any rational restraint. So we don't talk about who's right or what's true and what's false. Instead, we talk about what is empowering and what isn't. And this is extremely dangerous. It amounts to what we got in the Melian dialogue in Thucydides. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Unfortunately, as we see in the beginning of the Republic, sometimes the weak are the only people who know what's going on. And when the powerful many destroy or threaten to destroy the knowledgeable few, the result is catastrophic.
I had a broader, higher level question, which is that last week, obviously, we're considering Plato. This week, Aristotle. Plato's most renowned student, perhaps, is Alcibiades, who ends up being a very unjust and very unvirtuous person. And as you mentioned in your lecture, Alexander the Great ends up being a person who goes around destroying polises. So what are we to take away from this phenomenon of these people that we admire and their direct students being terrible, basically?
Well,
and Plato's tenure as an advisor to Dion of Syracuse as well.
All right. Well, remember, he ends up in jail. Right? It's just that Dion learns.
Same thing happened. Same thing happened between Husserl and Heidegger.
Yeah. Look, just because people are smart doesn't mean that they're good. All right. Rationality and love do not perfectly overlap. And what I would propose is something like corporate law in the following sense. I think teaching should be a limited liability profession where if I teach someone, I'm not responsible for all the stuff they do for the remainder of their life. I'm willing to give Jim Fribley his due in making his own choices. And the rest of my students, I'm willing to give the same freedom, even though they may make conflicting choices with Jim. I have some responsibility because I helped organize the way they think, but teachers do that to a greater or lesser degree. And even if they do it to the greatest possible degree, no real student is a photographic replica of his teacher's thinking. If you just take stuff from a teacher and say, I got taught this by Socrates, so it must be true, you're completely unsocratic and Socrates knows you're a waste of time. You are free to do with it what you want. We will give some, it's a little bit like parenthood. You have some responsibility, very limited, for what your children do. The younger they are, the more responsibility you have because the more immediate is your parental connection. But it seems to be unreasonable to hold an 80-year-old man responsible in any significant way for his 50-year-old children, right? So teaching is asymptotic. We want to teach what we know to be true and good and beautiful, or at least if you're my kind of teacher, you do. But we always know that there is impedance, so we never get that across fully or perfectly. And even if we were to do that by some miracle, they would not be able to receive that fully or perfectly. And then there's, of course, after that, there'll be the jump from theory to practice. So although I think that education is the most important political issue, I think there are limits to education and to its potential to redeem our politics. All right, now I know this is surprising, but we've been at this an hour already. I want to make a couple of announcements first, all right? First, I am sorry that my brain doesn't work anymore. It's been Swiss cheesed by anti-cancer drugs. And so it totally messed up my body, and it turns out my brain is a part of that. And a year ago, someone told me that I was about 98%, and now I figure I'm about 95%. And 95% of your brain is not like 95% of a loaf of bread where you pretty much have most of it. It's more like 95% of a bridge, in which case, as soon as you're lacking anything, that's all you're doing, right? Now, I lose my way and I lose my train of thought, and I can't hold on to complex thoughts the way I once did, all right? So what I'm going to try and do is when I lose my place, I'm just going to say, somebody prompt me because my brain is Swiss cheese. So I want you to keep that in mind. There's nothing I can do about it. Second thing is, although I was completely exhausted on Monday after doing this last week, I can't tell you how much I like teaching. Damn, I hated to be forced out into disability and forced out of my professorship. And what am I supposed to do? Walk up and down, getting ready to be dead? I mean, this really sucks. I have a telos too. This is what I was supposed to do. I mean, it's like greyhounds when they run, or bulldogs when they bite something, they figure out what they're supposed to do. Well, I know what I'm supposed to do. It's just that I don't have any students except my children, and that's a kind of hit and miss thing. So
on that note, you're the best teacher I ever had. I went to three.
I thank you for that.
3 degrees. You're the best teacher I ever had.
No man has ever stepped into the same river twice or entered the same classroom twice. That's the downside. The second thing I wanted to mention is that next week's readings are going to be a little bit lighter and a little bit easier. Look, nobody says, wow, I'm going to have a good time. I'm going to slog my way through Aristotle. One of my students once described it as like wading through wet cement while it dries around you. Have any of you had that feeling and trying to, is there one of you, even one, that did not look in the course of reading this to the last page of the book and then did the subtraction problem so you figured out how much of this you had to put up with? Okay. Next week, it's going to be, right. All right. Look, I used to be an undergraduate. I did the same thing. Next week, we're going to do two things. We're going to do Lucy and the Skeptic, who's funny, right? I think the comedy is cognitive, at least some of it is, and that it's actually at least as philosophical as tragedy is. So I'm going to want to talk at some length about what comedy is and what its potentials are. Comedy wins arguments by getting you to laugh, because once you laugh, you've already conceded the argument because you understand why it's funny. All right. That's why we should do our best to avoid political proposals that sound like they were written by The Onion. The second thing is that we're going to be reading Polybius. And here we're going to get a Hellenistic latter-day Greek trying to figure out what makes the Romans so great. And so he'll be a kind of bridge between Greek thought and Roman thought. And Polybius's idea of anacyclosis, the idea that history is cyclical, is going to be hugely important. First of all, because it's going to be characteristic of all ancient and medieval thought about history, until we get to Christianity, which is going to introduce the linear idea of history. Actually, it's in Judaism too, and it's probably also in Zoroastrianism, but I'd have to look at that. But the point then is this. We're going to talk about circular and linear views of history. On my YouTube channel, my pal, Dr. Staloff, who's running one of these discussion sections, he has a whole bunch of new lectures on theories of history. And look, the guy's got chops. He's really good at what he does. And I can't help but suggest that you might want to go look at some of his lectures on historical thinkers. The guy's great. And so next week, we're going to do some Greco-Roman thought. And that, I think, will be the end of our ancients. And then we're going to start moving to the medievals. And then we can get all modern and stuff. And for that reason, have good cheer. You're not going to be burdened by immense tomes that, you know, take a big chunk out of your time and your mental effort. Next week will be relatively easy and straightforward. I like to give students a sense of the fact that you might want to have a individual private life during your off hours of reading. Now, I never say that to real students that, you know, are in a classroom with me. There, I just tell them, oh, your life is mine now. Just read what I tell you, and I don't care whether you like it or not. Isn't that so, James? I mean, I express the greatest conceivable indifference to whether.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you were merciless. Right?
Yeah. Mercy is not always a virtue.
Yeah.
Sometimes being a
hard ass. Yeah.
I'm trying to find a nice word for it. The word I was thinking is bastard, but bastard with good intent. That being said, I'll see you all in a week, and read Polybius carefully and have some fun with Lucian. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you.